Get that dog out of my daughter's room now! Nora's voice sliced through the quiet like a blade, trembling with panic. Her robe swung behind her as she stormed down the hallway barefoot, heart thudding with fear and fury. It was 3:07 a.m. The nursery door was wide open, the crib was empty, and their family's German shepherd, Thor, was gone, with baby Violet in his jaws. Her husband, Mason, was already sprinting after them, flashlight in hand, feet pounding against the wet wooden porch. The storm had just passed, but the ground was still slick from the night's rain. Nora was shaking, not from the cold, but from the image seared into her mind. Her infant daughter limp in the jaws of a 100-pound dog. Thor was loyal, yes. Protective, yes. But this was unthinkable. Violet had only been home for 7 months, and the dog had never quite taken to her. He'd keep his distance, often watching her from doorways or pacing outside the nursery when she cried. Nora had dismissed it as adjustment. She had told herself the dog would learn, that he'd soften. But now her worst fears were coming true, and all the reassurances she had given herself felt like lies. Mason's flashlight caught the glint of fur through the trees. Thor was bolting toward the edge of the property, just beyond the fence where the forest thickened. "Thor! Drop her!" Mason roared, his voice echoing through the pines. But the dog didn't stop. He didn't even flinch. His jaws were tight, his body low to the ground, weaving through the brush with a speed that bordered on desperation. Nora stumbled, nearly falling, her breath ragged as the night swallowed her screams. They chased him for what felt like hours but could only have been minutes, until suddenly Thor stopped. Not in a clearing, not in some hidden den, but right beside the base of an old cedar tree, just yards from the back fence. Nora's heart nearly stopped as she caught up, her fingers clenched into fists, her eyes locked on the baby in his jaws. But Violet wasn't bleeding. She wasn't crying. She was sleeping. Thor laid her gently onto a patch of moss, then turned and began to dig beside her with frantic paws, growling low and rhythmic as if trying to beat something racing against time. Nora moved to grab her daughter, but Mason caught her wrist. "Wait," he said softly. "Just wait a second." She almost screamed at him, but then her eyes followed the dog's digging. A strange smell was rising, acrid, bitter, and oddly familiar. Gasoline. Then the heat hit them, a deep, suffocating wave from below, and just behind them, back at the house, the faintest flicker of orange light danced in the lower window, the boiler room, where Mason had been working the day before, where he'd smelled something off but dismissed it. Now it was alive and spreading. The fire hadn't started in the kitchen. It had started underground. Thor had known. He had known. Nora collapsed to her knees, arms folding around Violet's tiny frame, as the sky behind them turned a deeper, more terrifying red. Flames licked at the edges of the home they had built together, rising fast, loud and angry. But their daughter was safe, because of the dog she almost gave up on, the one she had just screamed at, the one who had dragged a baby out of her crib while her parents slept, unaware of the ticking time bomb under their floorboards. They called 911. The fire was contained. The nursery was gone. The boiler had cracked, leaking fuel into the sub-flooring. An accident that could have killed them all. But it didn't, because one dog couldn't sleep through the danger. That night, they didn't sleep. They sat outside with Violet between them, wrapped in a blanket, Thor resting at her side, eyes half-lidded but alert. And for the first time since Violet was born, Nora didn't feel like she had to watch the dog. She felt like she had to thank him. The smoke clung to the air like a warning that refused to vanish. Firefighters were still dousing the last of the flames as Mason stood beside the smoldering shell of their basement. Violet was safe, miraculously untouched, but the weight of what had almost happened was beginning to settle in. Nora sat on the back porch steps, clutching their baby, watching the rising sun through trembling lashes. She hadn't said much since the moment they escaped, and Thor, still muddy and panting, hadn't moved from Violet's side. Not once. She had spent weeks unsure about him. Every time Thor lingered in the nursery doorway or paced outside Violet's crib, she questioned his intentions. Every time she saw those amber eyes watching quietly, a voice in her mind whispered not to trust him. But now, that same stare was steady and full of something she couldn't name. Loyalty, yes, but also pain. As if Thor had been carrying the burden of knowing what no one else could see. When the fire chief approached, Mason walked over to meet him. The man removed his helmet, brushing soot from his face. You're lucky. If that dog hadn't gotten the baby out, the fire would have taken all three of you before we ever arrived. Nora's head lifted. Boiler leak, the chief added. Had to have been going for hours, maybe days. Built up pressure in the subfloor. Something, maybe static or wiring, ignited it. If the dog hadn't sensed it and acted when he did, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Mason returned slowly and knelt beside Nora. His hand touched her back gently, but her eyes were on Thor. He saved her, she said, barely above a whisper. And we didn't even notice something was wrong. Thor didn't move. He didn't seek praise or affection. He simply lay beside Violet's tiny feet, ears alert, as if he was still listening for danger. Later that afternoon, they took Violet to the hospital just to be safe. Thor came too. The nurses were hesitant at first, but Violet wouldn't stop crying until the dog was brought into the room. She reached for his ear, babbled something incoherent, and Thor rested his head gently against her crib, as if the two of them had some unspoken agreement. A pediatrician came in mid-visit, raising his brow at the sight of a German shepherd by the baby's side. Not your typical therapy animal, he joked, trying to lighten the mood. But when Mason explained what had happened, the doctor's smile faded. He listened, eyes wide, then looked down at Thor. That's not instinct, he said slowly. That's something deeper. That dog knew. Over the next few days, news spread fast. A local reporter showed up at the house once it was safe to return, asking questions, snapping pictures, trying to get Thor to sit still for an interview. But Thor wasn't interested in attention. He stayed near Violet, every moment, every breath. He'd rest at her crib during naps and sit beside her car seat during drives. It was as if saving her had changed him too. But what no one saw was the way Nora changed. She no longer saw Thor as the unpredictable dog who stared too long or hovered too close. She started to recognize the little things, how he tilted his head when Violet cried, how he lay across the threshold of the nursery like a gatekeeper, how he always looked back whenever she walked away with the baby in her arms. One evening, about a week after the fire, Nora found herself standing in the doorway of the nursery. The walls were still blackened in spots, and the scent of smoke clung stubbornly to the ceiling. But Violet had settled into a new crib, and Thor had claimed his place beneath it. Nora stood watching them, then slowly lowered herself to the floor. Beside him. I was wrong, she whispered, running a hand through his thick fur. I thought you were dangerous. I thought you were jealous, but you were just watching, making sure we were safe. I didn't trust you, and you still saved her. Thor's ears twitched, and for the first time since the fire, he licked her hand. Just once. Gentle. Forgiving. The next morning, Mason found a small plaque nailed beside the nursery door. Nora had put it up without saying a word. It read, "Protected by Thor, the guardian of 3 a.m." There was no ceremony, no grand celebration, just a quiet family with a home half rebuilt and hearts forever changed by a dog who listened when no one else did. A dog who didn't need to speak to be understood. A dog who loved before he was trusted. And from that night forward, Nora never questioned again why Thor watched. She knew, because sometimes heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they wear fur. The hospital room felt too clean, too still, like the chaos of the night hadn't even happened. Yet Nora couldn't shake the image from her mind. Thor dragging their daughter through the hallway, her tiny body limp, the front door open to darkness. That kind of fear doesn't leave easily. Even now, with Violet sleeping peacefully in a crib beside her and Mason speaking quietly to the nurse by the door, Nora's heart hammered every time she blinked. But what truly haunted her wasn't the fire. It was what the fire chief had told them earlier. If the boiler had exploded 5 minutes later, the whole house would have collapsed. The blast had originated directly beneath the nursery. No one would have survived. And Thor? He had somehow known. He's not just a dog, Mason had whispered on the drive over. I think he heard something, or smelled it, maybe felt it. I don't know. But he didn't panic. He acted. Yet for all the heroism Thor had shown, Nora's mind was still caught in conflict. Her maternal instinct was split between gratitude and guilt. She had doubted him. Worse, she had feared him. All those nights she pushed him out of Violet's room, told Mason to keep him on a leash indoors, closed doors between them. And still, he had protected them when it mattered most. Now, sitting beside her daughter in the quiet of the hospital, she watched the door slowly creak open. And there he was. Thor stepped in silently, his paws making no sound against the linoleum. His coat was still slightly singed at the tips, a patch near his side wrapped in gauze from where he'd gotten burned. But his eyes, those deep amber eyes, never left Violet's crib. The nurse hesitated, glancing at Nora, clearly unsure whether the animal should be allowed in, but Nora simply nodded. Thor padded to the crib and sat beside it, letting out a breath, as if he had been holding it since they arrived. Violet stirred slightly, and as if by instinct, one tiny hand reached toward the edge of the crib, fingers stretching toward him. Thor responded by resting his head against the base, eyes closing for the first time in hours. The nurse wiped her eyes and walked out quietly. Later that afternoon, the pediatrician returned, a calm, middle-aged man with silver in his beard and tired wisdom in his voice. He reviewed Violet's scans, took his time, then finally looked at Nora and Mason. "She's completely fine," he said. "No injuries, no signs of trauma, no smoke inhalation. Whatever that dog did, he did it in time." Mason looked at Nora, relief softening the tension in his jaw. But it was what the doctor said next that truly stuck. "I've seen service dogs pull people from fires, alert families before seizures, even detect cancer, but I've never seen one drag a sleeping baby out of bed in the middle of the night and place her safely outside. That's not training, that's love." And that word, love, struck Nora differently, because for months she had questioned Thor's presence in their lives. But what she hadn't realized was that love doesn't always look the way we expect. Sometimes it's loud, sometimes it's gentle, and sometimes it drags you through a hallway at 3 a.m. just to save your life. Back home a few days later, the scent of smoke still lingered faintly in the walls. The nursery was cordoned off, yellow, tape across the door. The damage had been worse than they'd realized. But Thor, once again, took his place at Violet's side, this time with no objections from Nora. In fact, she was the one who opened the door for him. They installed a temporary crib in their bedroom. At night, Violet would sleep inches away from her parents, and Thor would lie facing her, head on paws, ears twitching with every sound. Neighbors began stopping by. News had spread quickly through the town, and soon people were asking to see Thor. Some brought gifts, treats, toys, even a handmade collar embroidered with the word Guardian. But Thor never reacted to the attention. He wasn't interested in fame. His focus remained fixed on Violet. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and soft golden light poured into their living room, Nora sat cross-legged on the floor with Violet cradled in her lap. Thor lay beside them, his body curved protectively around them both. Mason stood nearby, filming a small clip for his sister who lived out of state. In the video, Violet squealed with joy as Thor nudged her cheek gently with his nose. She giggled, grabbed his ear, and babbled something unintelligible. Mason smiled. "She thinks he's her big brother." "No," Nora whispered, watching them. "He's her angel." She didn't mean it lightly, because when she thought back to that night, the moment she realized Violet was missing, the way the front door stood wide open, and the pure horror in her chest, she remembered what she found. Thor curled around her baby in the dewy grass under moonlight, shielding her, breathing with her, eyes wide and waiting. She remembered the explosion that came just minutes later, the way it lit up the house from beneath like a monster roaring awake, and she realized there are no accidents that perfect, no coincidences that precise. Thor knew, and even now, as life slowly returned to normal, that truth remained unshaken. She had spent so long fearing what Thor might do, until she finally saw what he was truly capable of. Not violence, not unpredictability, but unwavering, fearless, sacrificial love. And in that quiet, fire-scarred house, a bond stronger than blood had been born, not out of training or breeding or instinct, but out of choice. Thor had chosen to love, protect, and save, without hesitation, without condition, and the world, for one little girl, would never be the same. Mason hadn't slept in 2 nights. Not really. He lay on the living room couch with one arm over his eyes, listening to the faint creak of floorboards, the distant hum of the dehumidifier, and the steady breathing of Thor near Violet's crib. The house was still marked by the fire, smoke-stained walls, missing floorboards, exposed beams, but they had salvaged what mattered. Violet was alive, and the dog Mason had rescued from a broken shelter 2 years ago had now returned the favor, in a way no one could have imagined. But sleep wouldn't come easily, not when everything he believed about the world had been knocked off its axis. He kept going back to the look in Thor's eyes that night, before the blast, before the chaos. There was no panic in the dog's body, only a bone-deep resolve, as if he'd known exactly what he was doing. The following day brought a wave of strangers, reporters, neighbors, animal welfare advocates. Everyone wanted to meet the dog who had saved a child's life. Nora tried to shield Violet from the attention, but the story had already spread. Photos of Thor curled around the infant on the lawn had gone viral. Headlines called him the Canine Guardian and Hero Dog of Hollow Creek. But the press didn't know the full story. They didn't know how Thor had suffered before he came into their lives. They didn't see the scars beneath the fur, the quiet vigilance in every step he took, and they certainly didn't know what. The family now knew for certain. Thor had sensed something no human could have. That afternoon, a fire investigator returned with new findings. Mason stood at the front porch while Nora kept Violet inside. The man held a scorched piece of metal in his gloved hands, face drawn with exhaustion. It was the wiring beneath the floorboards, he explained. A rodent, likely chewed through. The insulation. The boiler's safety system was compromised. If your dog hadn't intervened when he did, your baby would have been directly over the detonation point. Mason's voice caught. But how could he know? The investigator just shook his head. Dogs smell cancer. They detect earthquakes. Maybe it was the heat, or gas, or maybe he just loved her enough to act before it was too late. That night, as Mason stood by the crib again, he watched Thor rise and circle the room before lying down beside Violet. The girl stirred, murmuring, in her sleep. Thor pressed his muzzle against the bars and exhaled slowly, calming her. Watching them, Mason realized something he hadn't dared admit before. Thor wasn't just protecting her. He was bonded to her. It hadn't started with the fire. It had begun much earlier. Subtle moments Mason hadn't understood at the time. Thor whining when Violet cried, pacing outside her door when she was sick, pressing himself against her crib when she had night terrors. He remembered one night Nora had scolded him for leaving, the nursery open, and Thor had whined until they closed the door. Only now did it click. Thor had been warning them. Everything suddenly felt connected. And yet, there was something deeper still. A question Mason couldn't shake. Why Violet? Why had Thor chosen her out of all people? Later that week, Mason called the shelter where Thor had been adopted. A kind woman named Brenda answered, and remembered the dog immediately. She told him Thor had once belonged to a veteran, a man who'd passed away in a house fire. The dog had been found outside the burning building, badly injured, trying to dig through the rubble. No one knew how he'd escaped, or why he hadn't run away. But the man's body had been found inside. They believed the dog had tried to save him. Stayed until the very end, she said softly. That's the kind of soul he has. Mason hung up the phone in silence. The weight of it settled slowly. Thor had tried once before to save someone from a fire, and failed. That loss had lived in his body ever since, shaping how he saw the world. So when the signs returned, the scent, the heat, the rumble beneath, the walls, he didn't hesitate. This time, he wouldn't lose someone he loved. The guilt, the ache, the fear, it had become instinct, and instinct had saved Violet's life. That night, Nora joined Mason in the nursery. She knelt beside Thor, running her fingers through the thick fur on his neck. We owe him everything, she whispered. But it doesn't feel like enough, does it? Just saying thank you. Mason nodded. No, it doesn't. So together, they made a decision. The next day, they registered Thor officially as Violet's service dog, not just in title, but in purpose. Wherever she went, he would go too. At school, at the doctor, on family trips, Thor would remain her protector, her shadow, her silent shield. In time, the story faded from the headlines. The repairs were completed, the nursery was rebuilt, and life moved forward. But some things never returned to the way they were. Violet took her first steps with one hand in Thor's fur. Her first word wasn't mama or dada, it was Tho. On her third birthday, she fell asleep curled into his side, the same way he had once wrapped himself around her in the grass beneath the stars. People would often ask Nora and Mason what made Thor so special, and they would answer, he wasn't trained to protect. He didn't learn to love, he simply chose to. In the quiet of the night, in the face of fire, in a moment no one saw coming, he chose to save her. And from that moment on, their lives were forever tied together by one unspoken truth. Sometimes it's not the ones we trust most who save us. Sometimes it's the ones we never fully understood, until they become everything. 3 years had passed since that night, since Thor, the quiet German shepherd with the weathered eyes, had dragged baby Violet from her crib and out into the cold before the fire swallowed the nursery whole. Yet, the moment still lived in Mason's bones like it had happened yesterday. Even now, when the wind howled or thunder shook the windows, he would glance at Violet's room just to check, and every time he'd find her safe, with Thor stretched beside her, always watching, always listening. The world had moved on. The news stopped calling, the reporters stopped asking, but their lives never returned to normal, because that kind of loyalty changes something inside you. Thor didn't just save a child, he gave a family a second chance, and Mason never stopped, carrying the weight of that debt in his heart. Violet was 4 now, full of energy and questions, and a voice that made strangers smile. She had Thor's old collar looped through her backpack and called him her guardian soldier. She didn't remember the fire. She didn't remember the chaos or the fear or the miracle that followed. But somehow, Mason felt she knew, deep down, that Thor had done something no one else could have. Their connection had grown stronger, wordless but unbreakable, like 2 souls tied in silence. But time, as it does, came to test that bond. One chilly November morning, Thor didn't get up. Violet called for him, tugged at his paw, but he only opened one eye and tried to wag his tail. Mason knelt beside him, trying not to panic, but the truth was written across Thor's face. He was tired, not just from the day, but from years. The vet said his heart was failing, slowly, gently, but undeniably. He'd given more than most dogs ever could, and now his body was asking for peace. That night, Violet cried herself to sleep holding Thor's paw. Mason sat on the edge of the bed, hands in his lap, eyes burning. "He can't leave yet," he whispered to Nora, who stood quietly by the door. "She still needs him." Nora walked over, her voice calm but heavy. Maybe he's given her all she needs. The next few weeks were a blur of vet visits, quiet walks, soft meals, and long silences. Thor never whimpered. He never withdrew. He stayed beside Violet every night, even when his legs began to fail him, even when he had to be lifted gently to his feet. His eyes always found hers. He still listened, still loved. On Christmas Eve, Violet placed a hand-painted ornament on the tree. It was shaped like a paw, painted in pink and gold, with Thor scrawled across it in crooked toddler letters. She stood back, admiring it, then turned to Thor, who lay beneath the tree's soft glow. "You're the star now," she said. The next morning, Thor was gone. Mason found him beneath Violet's crib, curled up like he had done every night since the fire. There was no struggle, no pain, just a stillness that didn't belong in something that had once held so much life. Mason knelt down, his chest collapsing inward, and pressed his forehead to Thor's. "Thank you," he choked. "Thank you for everything." They buried him beneath the old oak tree in the backyard, the place where Violet had learned to walk, the place where Thor had taught her what safety felt like. Nora planted flowers around the stone they laid, and Violet insisted on leaving her favorite toy beside it. Every evening she'd sit beneath the tree and tell Thor stories, her voice echoing through the yard like a lullaby, meant for a spirit that still listened. But grief is a strange teacher. It doesn't always come in waves. Sometimes it's a whisper in the hallway, a glance at an empty food bowl, a soft sigh that doesn't have a dog behind it anymore. Mason found himself checking the doors at night, listening for the scratch that never came. Nora would reach for the leash without thinking, and Violet would still sleep with a blanket bunched at her side, as if saving space for a body she couldn't forget. Months passed. Spring came. Life, slowly and stubbornly, began to move forward. One afternoon, Mason found Violet standing by the oak tree, holding a picture she'd drawn. It showed a girl and a dog standing side by side in a field of stars. She looked up at him and asked, "Do you think Thor knows I miss him?" Mason crouched, gently touching her hair. "He does, baby. I think he still watches you. Always will." She nodded once, then turned to the sky. "Then I'll keep being brave, so he knows he didn't waste his magic." And Mason realized something then, something he hadn't been able to see through the sorrow. Thor hadn't just saved Violet's life that night. He'd shaped it, molded it, protected it long enough for her to become someone who could face the world without fear. His job was done not because he was tired, but because she was ready. In the years that followed, Violet carried Thor's memory in everything she did. She grew into a girl who stood up for the small and the scared, who noticed when others were hurting. Who knew, without needing to be told, how powerful a quiet protector could be? And Mason, he never adopted another dog, not because he didn't want to, but because he knew no soul could ever replace the one that had chosen them in their darkest hour and given them the light to find their way back. Some said it was luck, some said instinct, but Mason believed it was something deeper, something sacred, because once in a lifetime, if you're lucky, someone walks into your life not to change it, but to save it, and Thor had done both.